Ethan Harper pulled his carry-on bag along the narrow jet bridge. His pace slow but deliberate. It was late afternoon at San Francisco International Airport, and he was catching a flight back home to New York after a series of demanding international flights. Ethan, a seasoned pilot with 20 years of experience, had spent the past week flying back-to-back routes across the globe, Sydney to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Tokyo, Tokyo to San Francisco. His body was tired, his mind clouded with fatigue, and his spirit longing for a few days of rest. But today was different. For once, Ethan wasn't in uniform, no crisp white shirt with navy epaulettes, no 4 gold stripes on his shoulders to signal his captaincy. Instead, he was dressed casually in his favorite gray hoodie and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. His wife, Lisa, had teased him earlier that morning. "You look more like a college student than an airline captain." Ethan had laughed, saying, "That's the point, I just want to blend in today." And blend in, he thought, was exactly what he needed. Thanks to an upgrade from his accumulated miles, Ethan had managed to secure a coveted first-class seat on this flight. It was a rare luxury for him. As a pilot, he typically spent his flights in the cockpit or, on the rare occasions he traveled as a passenger, back in coach, sitting in first class as a traveler, with no responsibilities or schedules to manage. Felt like an indulgence. As he stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of the cabin wrapped around him like a comforting blanket, air conditioning, faint hints of jet fuel, and the sterile tang of sanitized surfaces. A flight attendant greeted him at the door with a smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. Your seat is just on the right." Ethan nodded, smiling back. He rolled his bag down the aisle, passing rows of spacious seats that looked far more inviting from this side of the cockpit door. Finding seat 2A, he stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into the plush leather chair. For the first time in weeks, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. He reached into his bag and pulled out a dog-eared paperback novel, The Shadow of the Wind, a book Lisa had been urging him to read for months. As he placed the book on the wide armrest, he glanced around the cabin. A businessman sat across the aisle, already immersed in his laptop. Behind him, an elderly couple spoke softly, their hands clasped between their seats. Everything about the cabin exuded a calm luxury he rarely experienced, and he let out a deep sigh of relief. Ethan took out his phone and sent a quick text to Lisa, "On board. First class is nice. You'd love it." Her reply came almost instantly. "Enjoy it while you can. And don't forget to try those warm nuts, they're the best part." He chuckled softly, tucking his phone into his pocket. For the next 6 hours, Ethan planned to do nothing but relax, read, and let someone else do the flying for a change. Lauren Tate adjusted her navy blazer as she moved briskly through the first-class cabin. Preparing for departure, she had been a flight attendant for 5 years and took great pride in maintaining the highest standards for her passengers. She could spot an upgrade from a mile away. They were usually the ones fiddling awkwardly with the seat controls or snapping selfies with their champagne flutes. But today, her attention was drawn to 2A. The man sitting there didn't look like the typical first-class passenger. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, not the designer suits or trendy athleisure wear she was used to seeing up front. His carry-on bag was scuffed and utilitarian, unlike the sleek leather briefcases and Rimowa luggage she often saw. And instead of pulling out a tablet or laptop, he was reading an old paperback. Something about him didn't quite fit. Lauren approached his seat with her best professional smile. "Good evening, sir. May I take a quick look at your boarding pass?" The man looked up from his book, his expression calm but slightly tired. Without hesitation, he reached into the seat pocket and handed her the pass. "Thank you," she said, scanning it. Ethan Harper, seat 2A, first class, all in order. Yet, for reasons she couldn't explain, her suspicion lingered. "Did you receive an upgrade for this seat?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "No," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I paid for it." Lauren hesitated. The answer was straightforward, but something still felt off. She handed back the boarding pass. But instead of walking away, she pressed on. "We sometimes have issues with seat assignments. Are you sure there wasn't a mistake?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "I'm sure. Is there a problem?" The businessman across the aisle looked up. His pen paused mid-signature on a stack of documents. The elderly couple behind Ethan exchanged puzzled glances. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly, the low hum of pre-flight activity giving way to an uncomfortable silence. Before Lauren could respond, the head flight attendant, Clara Mendoza, approached. Clara, a seasoned professional with a calm authority, had noticed the growing tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes flicking between Lauren and Ethan. Lauren hesitated, suddenly aware of how the situation might look. "I was just confirming the passenger seat assignment," she said, handing back Ethan's boarding pass. "Everything appears to be in order." Ethan nodded once, retrieving his pass. "Good to know," he said evenly before returning to his book. His tone was calm, but the weight of the interaction hung in the air. Clara lingered for a moment, her gaze sharp as she assessed Lauren. "Let's make sure we're fully prepared for departure," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Lauren walked away, she felt the sting of Clara's unspoken reprimand. She also felt the lingering eyes of the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. The businessman across the aisle had resumed his work, but his glances in her direction carried a trace of disapproval. The elderly couple whispered quietly, their expressions tinged with unease. Lauren's chest tightened. She had handled the interaction poorly, and she knew it, but before she could dwell on it further, the intercom buzzed, and Clara's voice came through, calling her to the galley. Little did Lauren know, the day's events were about to take an unexpected turn. Ethan Harper had just flipped to the next chapter of his book when he noticed a faint commotion at the front of the plane. From the corner of his eye, he saw Clara, the head flight attendant, speaking urgently into her intercom headset. Her expression, which had been calm moments earlier, was now tense. Moments later, Clara approached his seat, leaning in so that no one else could hear. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice low but steady. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we've just had a situation arise in the cockpit. Our co-pilot is unwell and unable to fly. Captain Lawson has requested your assistance." The words took a moment to sink in. Ethan sat up straighter, closing his book and setting it aside. His instincts kicked in, and the fatigue that had weighed on him moments before was gone, replaced by a sharp focus. "Of course," he said, already rising to his feet. "Is the co-pilot okay?" "The medical team is with him now," Clara said, stepping aside to allow Ethan into the aisle. "He's stable, but they're recommending he not continue the flight." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing. As he moved toward the cockpit, he felt the weight of the passengers' stares. The businessman across the aisle looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and dawning realization. The elderly couple whispered to each other again, their earlier unease replaced by curiosity. Lauren, the flight attendant who had questioned him earlier, froze in the aisle, her eyes wide. Ethan didn't pause to explain. He stepped through the open cockpit door, where Captain Lawson, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Ethan Harper," Lawson said, recognizing him instantly. "Thanks for stepping in. I've heard good things about you." "Happy to help," Ethan replied, sliding into the co-pilot's seat and adjusting it to his preferences. The cockpit felt like home, even on an unfamiliar aircraft. He quickly scanned the instrument panel, familiarizing himself with the layout while Lawson briefed him on the situation. "The weather's clear all the way to New York," Lawson said, his voice steady. "We've got some minor turbulence over Pennsylvania, but nothing to worry about. Fuel's good, and we're on schedule. Let's get through the pre-flight checks together." Ethan nodded, already settling into the rhythm of the job. As he ran through the checklist with Lawson, he felt the familiar sense of control and purpose that came with flying. It didn't matter that he had planned to spend this flight as a passenger when duty called. He was ready. Back in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Lauren stood frozen in place, her mind racing. She had spent the last 10 minutes questioning Ethan Harper's presence in first class, only to watch him be called to the cockpit as an emergency co-pilot. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The man she had doubted, questioned, and subtly undermined was not just a legitimate passenger but a seasoned pilot stepping in to ensure everyone's safety. The businessman across the aisle glanced at Lauren, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Really?" The elderly woman in pearls shook her head in quiet disapproval, her husband murmuring something about jumping to conclusions. Even the tech entrepreneur in 1A, who had been glued to his laptop, looked up and removed his headphones, clearly interested in the unfolding drama. Lauren felt heat rise to her cheeks. She busied herself with pouring drinks, hoping to avoid the stares. But she couldn't avoid her own thoughts. What was I thinking? Why didn't I just trust the boarding pass? She glanced toward Clara, who was calmly managing the cabin as if nothing had happened. Lauren envied her composure but knew she had a long way to go before she earned the same respect from her peers. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the cabin lights dimmed, and passengers settled into their seats. Lauren made her rounds, offering drinks and snacks, but her mind was still on Ethan Harper. She couldn't shake the image of him calmly enduring her interrogation, never raising his voice or losing his patience. In the cockpit, Ethan and Captain Lawson worked in perfect harmony. The two men, though strangers, communicated like longtime colleagues, their shared expertise creating an immediate bond. As the plane taxied to the runway, Lawson glanced at Ethan. "I owe you one for this," Lawson said, adjusting his headset. "Not every pilot would step in on their day off." "Just doing my job," Ethan replied, his hands steady on the controls. "Besides, I'd rather be here than explaining to my wife why I let a flight get delayed." Lawson chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's get these folks to New York." The engines roared to life, and the plane surged forward, lifting smoothly into the sky. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Ethan felt a sense of pride and satisfaction. He was where he belonged, at the controls, doing what he loved most. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Lauren found herself lingering near the galley, her thoughts churning. She couldn't focus on her usual tasks, distracted by the memory of her earlier interaction with Ethan. The way he had handled her questioning, with patience and quiet dignity, stood in stark contrast to her own behavior. Clara approached her during a quiet moment, her expression unreadable. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. Lauren hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm fine," she said finally. "Just thinking about earlier." Clara nodded, crossing her arms. "It's not easy to confront your own biases. But the fact that you're thinking about it is a step in the right direction." Lauren looked down at her hands, fiddling with a napkin. "I just feel so ashamed. He didn't deserve that, and now he's up there, making sure we all get to New York safely." Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Lauren. What matters is what you do next. Use this as a learning experience. And when you get the chance, make it right." Lauren nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how she would approach Ethan, but she knew she couldn't let the flight end without addressing what had happened. The flight landed smoothly at JFK, the plane rolling to a gentle stop at the gate. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, Lauren waited near the cockpit door, her heart pounding. She knew Ethan would have to exit through this area, and she was determined to speak with him before he disappeared into the terminal. When Ethan finally appeared, still dressed casually in his hoodie and jeans, he looked tired but composed. His book was tucked under his arm, and his eyes scanned the cabin as if taking in one last look. "Mr. Harper," Lauren said, her voice quiet but steady. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Ethan paused, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a hint of curiosity. "Sure," he said. Lauren took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I owe you an apology. The way I treated you earlier, it was unprofessional. And it was wrong. I made assumptions that I had no right to make. And I'm sorry." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that," he said. "It's not the first time something like this has happened. And it probably won't be the last. But what matters is how you move forward." Lauren nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you. I'll do better." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can ask." With that, he extended his hand. Lauren shook it, feeling a sense of relief and closure. Lauren watched as Ethan walked down the jet bridge, his figure disappearing into the busy terminal. She felt both a weight lifted from her chest and a newfound heaviness, the responsibility to truly learn from her mistakes. The rest of the crew bustled around, finishing their post-flight routines. But Lauren stood still for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. Her thoughts were interrupted by Clara, who gave her a knowing look. "Feel better?" Lauren nodded. "I do, but I also know I've got work to do." "That's the important part," Clara replied. "Now, come on, let's finish up." As they wrapped up their duties and exited the aircraft, Lauren felt a subtle shift in herself. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore, she was determined to make meaningful changes. A few weeks later, Lauren found herself sitting in a brightly lit conference room at the airline's headquarters. The Understanding Unconscious Bias in Aviation seminar was about to begin. She'd seen the training listed many times before but had always dismissed it as unnecessary. Now, she was ready to face it head-on. The room filled with a mix of employees, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and even a few executives. The facilitator, a woman with a calm yet commanding presence, began the session by sharing a story about her own experiences with bias in the industry. As Lauren listened, she felt a pang of recognition. She wasn't alone in her struggles. And she wasn't the only one who needed to change. Throughout the session, participants shared their own stories. A young ground crew member spoke about being underestimated because of her size. A pilot recounted the subtle ways his authority was questioned because of his accent. Each story added another layer to Lauren's understanding, and she realized how pervasive these issues were. When it was her turn to speak, Lauren hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, she shared her experience with Ethan Harper. She spoke about the assumptions she had made, the way she had questioned him without cause, and how his calm professionalism had highlighted her own shortcomings. It wasn't just about him being a pilot, she said, her voice steady but emotional. It was about recognizing that my job isn't just about serving drinks or keeping things orderly. It's about seeing people, truly seeing them, and treating them with the respect they deserve. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the facilitator nodded. Thank you for sharing that, Lauren. It's not easy to confront these things. But that's how we grow. Meanwhile, Ethan Harper had returned to his regular flying schedule. But the memory of that flight lingered with him. He mentioned the incident to his wife, Hannah, one evening as they prepared dinner. She apologized, he said, slicing vegetables with practiced precision. I think she meant it. Hannah looked up from the stove, her expression thoughtful. Do you think it'll change anything? I hope so, Ethan replied. People don't always get it right the first time. But if they're willing to learn, that's what matters. Over the next few weeks, Ethan noticed subtle changes in his interactions with crew members. Word of what had happened on the flight seemed to have spread, sparking conversations about bias and professionalism. Pilots and flight attendants alike approached him to ask about his perspective, sharing their own stories of facing assumptions and challenges. One day, during a routine layover, he received an email from the airline's leadership team. They were interested in creating a mentorship program for underrepresented employees in aviation and wanted his input. Ethan smiled as he read the email. He had always believed in the importance of mentorship, and this felt like a chance to make a broader impact. Lauren's experience on that flight continued to shape her approach to her job. She became an advocate for bias training, encouraging her colleagues to attend the sessions and sharing her own story whenever it felt appropriate. Over time, she noticed a shift in the way her team interacted, not just with passengers, but with each other. One afternoon, during a flight to Los Angeles, Lauren encountered a young woman wearing a hijab who looked nervous as she settled into her seat. The passenger in the next row gave her a suspicious glance, and Lauren felt a flicker of recognition. This was the kind of moment that could escalate if not handled carefully. She approached the woman with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said. "If there's anything you need, just let me know." The woman relaxed slightly, nodding her thanks. Lauren made a point of checking in on her throughout the flight, ensuring she felt comfortable and supported. By the time they landed, the woman thanked her personally. "Your kindness made a big difference," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Lauren felt a surge of pride, not for herself, but for the small steps she was taking to make things right. Months later, Lauren and Ethan crossed paths again at an airline conference. Ethan was there as a keynote speaker, presenting on the importance of mentorship and diversity in aviation. Lauren had been invited to share her story as part of a panel discussion on customer service and bias. After Ethan's speech, which earned a standing ovation, Lauren approached him. "Mr. Harper," she said, extending her hand. "It's good to see you again." Ethan smiled, shaking her hand firmly. "Lauren, right? How've you been?" "Better," she said, her smile genuine. "Thanks to you." They spent a few minutes catching up, sharing updates on their respective efforts to create change within the airline. Lauren told Ethan about the training sessions she had attended and how they had influenced her work. Ethan spoke about the mentorship program he was helping to develop and the positive feedback it had received. "You know," Ethan said as they parted ways, "awareness is just the first step. But I think you've taken that step and then some." Lauren felt a deep sense of gratitude as she watched him walk away. She knew her journey wasn't over. But she also knew she was on the right path. Over the years, both Ethan and Lauren continued to make an impact in their fields. Ethan's mentorship program became a cornerstone of the airline's diversity initiatives, helping dozens of young pilots and crew members find their footing in the industry. Lauren, now a senior flight attendant, became a trusted mentor herself, guiding new hires and sharing the lessons she had learned. Their story became part of the airline's culture, a reminder that change often begins with uncomfortable truths and difficult conversations. And while neither of them sought recognition for their efforts, they both took pride in knowing they had made a difference. For Ethan, every flight was a chance to inspire the next generation of aviators. For Lauren, every passenger was an opportunity to practice the values she now held dear. And for both of them, the journey was proof that even the smallest moments, like a conversation in a first-class cabin, could lead to lasting change. Years after their paths first crossed, the impact of Ethan Harper and Lauren Cooper's story was still felt throughout the airline industry. The mentorship program Ethan helped create grew into a global initiative, spreading to other airlines and aviation organizations. Dubbed Wings of Opportunity, it became a symbol of what the aviation industry could achieve when diversity, inclusion, and mentorship were prioritized. Lauren's contributions didn't go unnoticed either. Her decision to confront her biases head-on inspired many of her colleagues to examine their own behaviors. She became a prominent advocate for inclusive practices, often speaking at training sessions and conferences about her personal transformation and the lessons she learned from her experience with Ethan. The mentorship program Ethan had poured his heart into expanded to include not just pilots but also ground crew, engineers, and flight attendants. Each participant was paired with an experienced professional who offered guidance and support, creating a network of connections across the aviation world. One of the mentees was a young woman named Amara Singh, a first-generation college graduate who had always dreamed of becoming a pilot. Despite her talent and dedication, she often felt out of place in an industry that seemed dominated by people who didn't look like her. Through the program, she was paired with Ethan Harper as her mentor. "Everyone doubts themselves at some point," Ethan told her during one of their mentorship sessions. "But flying isn't just about skills. It's about trusting yourself and knowing you belong." Years later, Amara would become one of the youngest captains in the airline's history, often citing Ethan as the person who gave her the confidence to chase her dreams. Lauren's growth didn't stop with her own journey of self-reflection. She began creating new training modules for flight attendants, working closely with the airline's leadership team to ensure that bias awareness was integrated into the onboarding process. She also proposed the creation of a "Dignity First" policy, a simple yet powerful guideline to treat every passenger and colleague with respect, regardless of assumptions or preconceived notions. On a routine flight to Sydney, Lauren encountered a nervous-looking teenage boy traveling alone for the first time. His worn clothes and battered backpack caught the attention of a few other passengers, who whispered among themselves. Lauren made it a point to engage him warmly, ensuring he felt comfortable and welcome. When the boy disembarked, he handed her a folded note. "Thank you for being kind." It read, "I was scared, but you made me feel like I belonged." Lauren kept the note in her purse as a reminder of why she had chosen to change, not just for herself, but for everyone she encountered. Several years later, Ethan and Lauren found themselves once again sharing the stage at an aviation conference. This time, they were co-presenters for a keynote address titled, "The Human Side of Aviation: Building Bridges at 35,000 feet." Lauren began by recounting her initial misstep with Ethan. "I was so focused on my perception of professionalism and who I thought belonged in first class that I forgot what my job was really about: making every passenger feel safe, welcome, and valued. It took one man's grace and patience to show me the error of my ways." Ethan followed her speech with his own insights. In aviation, we often talk about turbulence as something to navigate or avoid. But there's another kind of turbulence, the kind we face within ourselves. in our assumptions and biases. Tackling that turbulence is just as important as flying through clear skies. Their joint presentation was met with a standing ovation, and attendees approached them afterward to share how their words had resonated. Ethan and Lauren realized that their story wasn't just about one flight, it was about how small moments of growth could ripple outward, affecting countless others. By the time Lauren was promoted to an in-flight operations manager, she had overseen the training of hundreds of flight attendants. Each one carried her message forward, ensuring that passengers of every background felt respected and valued. Her influence extended beyond her airline, as other carriers began adopting similar training practices and policies. Ethan, meanwhile, transitioned into a leadership role within the airline, overseeing pilot training and safety protocols. He made it a point to include modules on bias awareness and leadership development in the training curriculum. His mentorship work continued to inspire a new generation of pilots who carried his lessons with them into the skies. One day, years after that fateful flight, Ethan was walking through the terminal of an international airport when he heard a familiar voice. Turning around, he saw Lauren, now in her crisp managerial uniform, guiding a group of flight attendants through a pre-flight briefing. She spotted him and broke into a wide smile. "Captain Harper, it's been a while." Ethan chuckled. "It has, but it looks like you're keeping busy." Lauren nodded. "And it looks like you're still inspiring people. I just met one of your mentees, Amara Sane. She speaks very highly of you." Ethan felt a swell of pride. "She's incredible. A real testament to what's possible when people are given the chance to shine." They chatted for a few minutes, catching up on their respective careers and the progress they'd seen in the industry. As they parted ways, Lauren paused. "Ethan," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I want you to know, what you did that day. It didn't just change how I see my job. It changed how I see people. And it's made me better in ways I can't even explain." Ethan smiled, his expression warm and sincere. "I think we both learned something that day, Lauren, and as long as we keep paying it forward, that's what really matters." As Ethan boarded his next flight, he took a moment to reflect on his journey. From the challenges he had faced as a young pilot to the meaningful connections he had forged over the years, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His career wasn't just about flying planes, it was about building bridges, breaking down barriers, and leaving a legacy of inclusion and possibility. Lauren, meanwhile, continued her mission to ensure every flight was an opportunity to practice kindness and understanding. She knew she still had work to do, but she embraced it wholeheartedly, knowing that change was a lifelong journey. Together, their story became a beacon for the aviation community, a reminder that awareness is only the first step and that true growth lies in what we do next.